What a brilliant conversation, an incredibly inspirational person. And you only have to kind of sit in her company in that very digital space to feel the profound gift. I think that is how I would describe Sarah. Has a gift that's clear. She's drawing reference from her work as an academic and researcher and a practitioner, but there's something that transcends any of those labels to make her an incredible healer and gatherer of insight to inform what's needed.
Obviously is brilliant at what she does, and I think she's also created a gift for the world in her books because people can just pick them up and read them and get their own healing without necessarily needing a therapist to do so.
Yeah, just a great inspiration. Looking forward to what she brings to Oxford and think that, it's one to watch. Hi, Sarah. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the podcast today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Emma. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm Dr. Sarah Woodhouse. I started in trauma in academia. So I researched trauma for about 12 years, and then I went into private practice. And now I run a very busy private practice, seeing adults that have CPTSD, developmental trauma, PTSD as well. And I'm also head of trauma-informed care at Reconstruction Unlimited, which is a mental health agency that creates kind of bespoke teams around clients in crisis and their families.
Amazing. And I'm fascinated by you starting. For me, I love the fact that you started in research and then you became a therapist, and I think you're also a coach, aren't you? So those three things to me that really are the most fascinating in the way that they work together. And if you could talk about how starting in research, how you managed to move, or why you moved to setting up a private practice from academia.
The honest truth, so my research was very applied. So I was very lucky to work with some really cool charities and organisations that were doing great work in the mental health space and in trauma space. I worked with NCP, so National Childbirth Trust, worked with some great veterans charities, violence against women charities. So it was all very applied. But towards the end of the research, I just felt like it wasn't applied enough for me. I wasn't kind of meeting people in the way that I wanted to. So it was very top level, and that knowledge has filtered down. I did a great meta-analysis into the relationship between different attachment styles and trauma, for example. And that's been, it's of course very helpful thing to have studied. But for me, it just wasn't applied enough. It wasn't on the ground enough, so I just had this real yearning to do more, I suppose, is what I wanted to do. And then went into, so I'm a coaching psychologist. So it's slightly different to a coach where you're, but you can imagine it's slightly different where you're applying psychological principles, and for me, it's all about kind of working with in sort of clients that have high stress. So that's the kind of link there. And then trained in IFS as well. So I combine the two.
I just wanted to say, because I don't know if you know this, but we also work. I'm the executive director of the Trauma Research Foundation, and Emma and I work very closely with TRF. And one of the things that we see, there's always this kind of, and Bessel always talks about it, this disconnect between researchers and clinicians and researchers, and how, I don't know if you have a perspective on how we can make clinical practice more interesting to researchers and research more interesting to clinicians. How can we bridge that gap? Because it would be so important. It is so important that the two speak to each other, but they don't very easily, I think.
There's great things happening in practice that could be amplified with validation in research, and great learning and insight, kind of being gathered in research that's not applied sufficiently with scale to have the impact that it can have in practice. And so that's this idea of this virtuous circle. And obviously you're a lived example of that. So just keen to see what your thoughts are as to why there is that disconnect and what we could do to maybe forge a stronger, virtuous relationship.
Yeah, it's super interesting. When I set up the practice, I was absolutely adamant. So my intention was that everything would feed back into research. And I set up the software to allow me to do that. And I was tracking outcomes. The reality is that I don't have time. The reality is that the client needs are so high. So I suppose what I'm saying is, in practical terms, I think for clinicians, it's really hard. It's just really, really hard. So say, and I have been approached, if I was to have a conversation, say, with a university and they were going to give me a researcher who would do that for me, that then I would be very, very open to that. But me as lead clinician, my priority now absolutely is my clients. And so, all these ideas that I had, and I really did, I was so almost naive in terms of what I wanted to create and how that would feed back in. And I suppose I say that I do feel a bit disappointed I haven't been able to, but also, there's been such a shift. So the shift has been away from that more global knowledge to just basic client well-being.
And how did you distill from that kind of global picture, the breadth into the depth that you practice now, which is this intersection between IFS and
Yeah,
sorry,
in coaching psychology. Yeah,
coaching
IFS
psychology?
and coaching psychology, which is really interesting because coaching psychology kind of subsumed into that is all the nervous system piece. That's what I was trying to say about the kind of stress disorders. So it fits beautifully in terms of the trauma response, and you've got that mind body piece that's woven into any psychological training.
How do you go from this whole landscape of potential approaches to healing to deciding that I'm going to focus on IFS, internal family
Yeah.
system, and the intersection with coaching psychology, which I would like you to define in your own language as well, so that our audience is clear on, those two pieces, the intersection of them, and why you pick them?
I mean, it took me a very long time to choose what to train in. My focus and my understanding is all different trauma models, so they're kind of glued into my head, and I think, honestly, I think it's that underpinning that makes me such a great clinician because of the breadth. And I would recommend it to anyone as a start point. You can narrow your focus if you train in a specific therapy, in a specific treatment modality that then completely you become quite blinkered. And I see that all the time. I'm referring to I'm SE practitioners, I'm referring to EMDR, I'm referring to, and you can feel the narrowness of the vision. So I would recommend it as a start point, having studied it in depth in the way that having been so aware of the different mechanisms and the different models, you do get this kind of top level understanding all the time as I'm listening to a client or to another clinician. I can feel my research brain kind of slotting it into the different models, and I'm aware of, that's the cognitive, maybe it's secondary appraisals. And so I'm drifting between the different models all the time. And I think as a start point, it's incredibly powerful. And in terms of how I sort of chose, I very well might train in SE next year. I feel like that would be helpful. I'm intrigued. I mean, obviously I know a lot about it and I work with SE practitioners, but in terms of the choice, coaching psychology was logical because it had the nervous system, the body piece in it, and it was such a natural kind of, I'd studied trauma, and it was just the easiest way for me essentially, it was just the easiest way for me to move into private practice, but in my mind, keeping that top level approach,
Mhm,
i.e. rather than training in a specific modality.
mhm,
So it felt very kind of generalist almost, which it
mhm.
is. There's so many different branches of it. For me, it was all about kind of compassion focus, the nervous system, pulling in the bits that I wanted, and then I kind of bolted IFS over the top.
I think it's so important. Like I really, what you say about there are so many different modalities, but that there are so many different people who have so many different needs, and what someone might need or what might work for someone at the beginning of their kind of when they come to see you at the start, in 6 months' time, a year's time, they might need a completely different way of dealing with something. Something else might come up that they might need, that IFS won't get to, or that somatic experiencing won't get to, and suddenly they need something totally new. And I think having that background in research where you do know so much, you've got this, as Emma said, like this breadth of like knowledge around trauma healing, from veterans to domestic abuse charities or whatever, all the other things that you said. I think it's only going to be extremely helpful for your clients, really.
Without doubt, absolutely. Yeah, and I think I don't know if you see it, but you see clinicians all the time kind of holding on to clients. I mean, I'm lucky I've written the book, so I have huge number of kind of, referrals and requests for work. So that obviously allows me not to, that's a practical reason that I can be extremely fluid in terms of, okay, this isn't quite working, let's try that. But it is so important, no approach is for everyone. I can send someone. Actually, I'm very careful on who the clients I refer for EMDR, but SE isn't for nothing is for everyone. It just absolutely isn't. I'm not for everyone. None of us are for everyone.
And thank God,
Thank God, absolutely.
absolutely, we'd all be
Yeah.
inundated otherwise.
Can we just hone in on that a little bit? Because I think what we're talking about there is this ability to, one, build relationship with the client that you're working with in that moment, and two, what I'm hearing, but what we're met is this sensing, this ability to kind of use that cognitive piece that's come from research, the experience that's come from practice, and be able to both like intellectually, but also, I mean, we're talking about somatic experiencing, but also in a kind of tangible way, feel what that client needs. And, I think that's a conversation that we don't hone in on enough, is that kind of the relational piece and that sensing piece around direction. And do you want to speak to that at all?
For me, a colleague, so the great thing about my role at Reconstruction is that I'm part of a lot of MDTs, and it really is the most incredible way to work. And I would recommend it to any practitioners. It was only yesterday, there were 6 clinicians all talking about the same family, same clients, psychiatrists, different modalities in terms of therapists all coming together. And it's really exciting. It's a lovely, lovely feeling. And I think that's an important piece of it, is the feedback that we're getting there. But the feedback that I got from someone, and they were kind of joking, but they said, you are an exceptional therapist, you're an exceptional trauma clinician, but honestly, it's not you being an incredible therapist that makes you a great therapist. It's because you are completely relational. Like everything you're doing is about the relationship. And I don't know why, but I just came into private practice and just intuitively understood, I have a trauma history. I get it. I just get it. I get what's needed. Even if I can tell, okay, I'm not quite the right fit for you, I understand that it's about the relationship and me showing up authentically from a place of self, that in part is the healing. And in terms of sensing and knowing what a client needs, it's really interesting because I'll have requests from people, can I come and train with you? Can I? And I've thought about that. And through RU, so through Reconstruction, could you create some training programs? And it's really interesting, isn't it? Thinking what's trainable, like what can we impart and what actually is just simply built through experience, and I will have people say, like, with all due respect, you've got these clinicians that you refer to, but it has to be you. Not because I'm astonishingly good, but because, I don't know, there's experience, there's relationship.
Is that piece, and like we said, not everyone is for everyone, but if you are able to understand that the relationship is the most important piece when someone is coming with a trauma history, more often than not, there is a disrupted attachment piece there, that especially if it's developmental trauma, and that to have that relationship, to build that trust, is the most important kind of part of any therapeutic relationship that you can have. And I think if you know that, some people may not understand that, and I don't know if that can be taught, that ability to build relationships. I don't know whether it can or not. If it can, then bottle it up and sell it, because that's really important. But I don't know that some people just haven't got the ability to build relation with others, I think.
That's the bit though that I always think, Minta, with you and I, like when we're looking for kind of people to contribute, that is one of the pieces that needs to be talked about more. Is it an innate ability? Is it about experience? Is it about the conditions in which you put yourself before you go into those other things that you do to build? People talk about building capacity, or, is it creating the stage? What kind of what creates the fertile ground for that relationship to foster? Because we hear time and time again, regardless of modality or perspective on how to heal.
It's a bit. I think it's a bit of both, because let's talk about Sarah, for example. Sorry, Sarah, to talk about you whilst you're in front of us, but like,
I'm intrigued. Go ahead.
obviously have like a I think the groundwork in the years of research and the kind of deep expertise of trauma and your own trauma history is huge in kind of setting you up to be a good clinician. If you then put that on top of the ability, the intuitive, innate ability to build relationships with people and to have healed your own self enough to be able to do that too, because I think there is potentially that can also be a factor in our field, that people aren't necessarily healed enough to be open enough yet boundaried enough. So you've got these two things: you have to be open enough to let someone in, but boundaried enough to make them feel safe and keep yourself safe. So to have all of that, I think that's what makes a great clinician. Now, not everyone will have 12 years of research, not everyone will have personal experience. You kind of seem to tick a lot of those boxes. That's my feeling.
Yes, and we have met brilliant practitioners that don't have that research background, but that can do that piece. We've also met incredible researchers that don't have the ability to build the, like it seems like it's this almost like you need like a graphic equalizer almost, and you need all the dials to be dialed up to at least a baseline volume to create that. I'm curious about it more than anything. I don't think I have an answer. It's just more of like, it's cited as one of the key contributing factors to the success of any sort of therapeutic journey. And yet we seem to know so little about how the conditions to create that relationship and that trust. So yeah, maybe I've sidelined us a little bit there, but it is.
No, I love it. It's just so important, and I love thinking about that. I think it's fascinating. I think there has to be intention. That i.e. that fictional researcher that you just described who wouldn't be or isn't a great clinician, maybe doesn't have the intention of wanting to be. There has to be that desire to learn about relationships, to learn what connection is, to really want to feel into that space and get good at it. That has to be there. But without doubt, I love the way you just described that. I'm into that. It is the capacity, the ability to connect and be open and boundaried. It's both of those. And that is for me, that is completely reliant on. I mean, look, that it certainly is reliant on some of the training and some of the research, but really that is about my recovery and my healing. 100%. That's what I stand in my opinion.
And that's why I think compassion and empathy come up often. It's like, how do I show up to this individual and meet them where they are with a level of humanity and humility that transcends the kind of the taught piece.
I remember a conversation we had with some, I think it was psychedelic researchers actually that we were talking to, and they were doing they were going to do training. I don't know if you remember. And we were saying, what's your kind of ideal person to do this training to then deliver psychedelic interventions? So this person or this team of people said there's no, you could be a nurse, you could be a psychotherapist, you could be I don't know, they listed a whole range of like different kind of careers that could take you into the position of being a psychedelic facilitator. And they said it's not about, for them, it was literally an attitude. They would assess people for I think it was how present were those people able to be in a space with them when they were interviewing them for the kind of training, because they only wanted to train maybe 20, 50 people. I can't remember how many, but it was their ability to be present in a room, because they said when they're facilitating psychedelic journeys, the most important thing is that you're able to be present with the person in the space and hold them in that space. And I guess there's things like that that ability for me, I would be a terrible therapist. I can't be present with anyone for more than like 10 minutes hardly. Like, I mean, this is already, we're going too far to for me, like but I think that is a big part of it as well, isn't it? It's to be able to be like, people might be talking about a lot of stuff that might interest you, might not, wouldn't interest me, but then to stay there and be present with them in that session, I think is a big part of it.
I think they also talked about regulation, didn't they? The ability to remain, there was like a piece around regulation and being able to kind of control your own response, because that reading those micro adjustments and understanding what's happening to somebody, for me, it's a fascinating conversation, because it seems to be a big deciding factor as to how successful interventions are.
Ruth Cohen also talks about the non-verbal cues, right, that you get and I always am interested in when you're doing online therapy, how much more difficult is it to kind of pick up on those? You might hit something that dysregulates a client, or be talking about something that dysregulates a client, and to see they might not say it, but there might be something in their physicality that changes. That is it much more difficult to pick up on that if they're online than if they're in person? No.
No, honestly, no, it's wild to me. It's energetic. You just pick up on it in a moment. It's wild. And I still find that the most astonishing thing, and why it's relational. It's fascinating to me. I'll notice a shift and I can kind of feel it almost, in my body. It's like, oof, okay, what was that? Maybe in a first session, so I won't report it back in the same way that I might. I won't kind of be like, hey, I'm just, and then maybe a week, 2 weeks later, the client will say, do you remember when we were talking about that? And they'll say, I got really dissociated, and it's like, yeah, no, and literally know to the moment when that happened. But I find it almost makes me tingly thinking about it. I know that it is this relational, energetic thing that's going on. So no, I don't personally find it to interfere with that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I think, yeah. Oh, so Sarah, talk to us a little bit about the book. 'Cause I remember the last time we spoke, you hadn't, it wasn't published yet, and we weren't really, you weren't really able to talk about it that much. But I'd love to hear a bit more about it now, and now it is released.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, it's called The Power of Self-Healing, and it's about how to support therapeutic trauma healing day to day, essentially. And it's really a call to action is the idea. It's sort of, yes, you can show up every week, but unless you're also pulling tools, techniques, practicing, noticing, practicing, moving with curiosity, applying different principles as you go through the rest of the week, it's not going to integrate in the way that you wanted to. So it's all about helping clients integrate. I'm all about, as you said at the beginning, I'm like democratization. There's a huge amount in my head and I want to give it to people, so the idea is, I run a private practice, there's a set fee there, and although it's flexible, even that, there are some that can't afford it. So it's trying to deliver that knowledge in a way that is genuinely applicable and helpful. I think the truth is, and I don't think I say this in the book, maybe I do, I went into 12-step recovery when I was about 26 for food. So I went into OA. I was anorexic, bulimic in my teens. And that is all about action. It's all about there's a spiritual piece, but it's really about holding yourself accountable and taking daily action. And it was recognizing for me the importance of being called to accountability, called to take action, the importance of routine, repetition, consistency, that a 12-step recovery calls you to and holds you to. As I reflected on my own, and during that time I was also working with SE practitioners, doing my own trauma healing, but recognizing what that underpinning gave me was my personal motivation, was trying to help people see that it needs to become life, it's a way of living.
So this is like an ally for the clients, but ultimately a therapeutic tool for practitioners that are wanting to kind of make sure that the work that they're doing when they're together is kind of consolidated and integrated and becomes embodied, as opposed to this kind of, because quite often the sessions themselves are quite heady. So it's for both, I guess. It's both for the individuals, maybe those that are working with a practitioner, but also for those that aren't. You're saying it's relevant for them too.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the idea, is to, yes, exactly. It's for both. Yeah.
I think it's really important, and it's a really kind of good thing to kind of note that when you are in recovery of any description, one therapy session a week, be an hour, maybe 90 minutes, sometimes maybe less. That's never going to be enough. It's like you need more to fill your time. Like you have spent your whole previous life in those behaviors, whatever they might be, the negative, destructive ones, to kind of, you need to fill your time with more positive things. And I think having a tool that will help you continue and consolidate, as Emma just said, is really, really going to be useful. Actually, I know it would have been for me, certainly in the early days. So it's great that you
I hope so. Just practical, just trying to, as I said, I really am not obsessed with that, but it is a key driver for me, is just democratizing, just
Is it really accessible? Because like 5 years ago, I was new into this field. Like I, worked in consultancy, like pharma, fast moving consumer goods, and came into this space and was like, wow, you think there's only these kind of tools at our disposal. And in fact, there's such a vast array, clinical, cultural, practice led, somatic, and, like, is it? But the way that this field talks to itself is often, I mean, we use lots of acronyms today in this conversation that for many, tried to kind of, well, maybe get them in the show notes, what they mean. But is the book written in a way that if you have no experience, if this is your first dipping your toe first into the concept of healing from trauma, is it accessible to anyone?
I think that's a great question. And I'm going to answer honestly, because that is my commitment to myself. I've written 2 books. The first is incredibly accessible, and it was literally designed for people who maybe hadn't even heard the word trauma. It's called You're Not Broken, and it's really designed to be incredibly accessible. My sense with the second, and the feedback that I've had, it's more appropriate for people that have some kind of knowledge of trauma healing, of therapy. That's true. I would say that's true. And I don't mind. When I first started on social media, which I'm not good at, and I post very little now, one of my ideas was called therasplaining. So I was really trying to it's so
Yeah.
irritating, the words and the terms, and even some of the simple terms that we use. And certainly as I practice, I try not to move into that. So I get it as a principle, it's really important. And my honest answer would be, first book, 100% accessible. Second, very accessible, but probably more for people who have some comfort level around the therapeutic space.
Well, that's great because it gives people a jumping off point and then an ability to kind of work. And I do think that audiences are becoming better educated, more equipped. Some of these modalities are reaching broad audience. There's still so much work to be done. Like, really, to think about how some products and services in the world have skyrocketed and are in the kind of everyone's frame of reference in some way, shape, or form, but have very little real value to humanity. For me, I still struggle with the concept of these incredible tools, approaches, ideas, and concepts being so peripheral. But I do think they've gone from totally peripheral to being pulled in a little bit, just by the exaggerated need that we see in the world. But yeah, it's good to know that there's 2 books of both levels people can
Yeah.
walk through
But
to.
really, I couldn't agree more, and I drive myself mad trying to think of how to make things more accessible, but keep the standard,
Yeah.
it's really hard. It is actually really hard, as I'm thinking about, so for RU, I design experiential intensives, and they cost money. Of course they do, and then I'll think, okay, well, how can I take that and tailor it? And you can see the drop off in terms of quality. So
Yeah.
so has to be realism around that, and it is really, really hard. But I agree, Emma. I spend a lot of time thinking about how we can do that.
And that in itself is a really important message, is looking after the integrity of the approach so that it doesn't become diluted in its potency in execution, but making sure people are aware of it so that they can find ways of jumping on that are accessible to them, whether that's geography, price, culture, whatever that accessibility needs look like. Then there's a way of being able to kind of look across that landscape of possibility and have some, we talk a lot about empowering the individual. So it's not just relying on you going and sitting with someone and them being the expert, but there's some groundswell of demand because people have got some base level of understanding of what these tools are and how they can be deployed in their healing journeys. That's what keeps me up at night.
No, me too. The thing I love, or what? No, there's lots of things that I love, but one of the shifts that I've enjoyed is the kind of ecotherapy thing, and how that's overlaying onto anything that I know about trauma healing, and that is so accessible. Often when we're designing these intensives, there is a sense of, right, we have to get them in. It has to be in nature. And this just intuitive understanding of how grounding it is to be in the Arizona desert or the mountains in Scotland. And, that you can see there's a kind of groundswell of that kind of, do you know what I mean? You must hear about
Yeah,
it, that kind
totally.
of ecotherapy thing, and that is so accessible. That
Yeah.
really is literally accessible to all of us.
Well, and that seems like a good segue into spirituality, because this year at Oxford, it's kind of something that we're exploring, and I'm keen to get your perspective as an academic and a practitioner on the role you see spirituality playing in what you do.
I think it's the center of it. I think it is essential. I think I find it very, so for me personally, it's central to my recovery, my understanding, and what I say to clients. Not every client, that's the thing. There's a lot of, it's not for everyone. There are some clients who simply won't go there.
But I guess it depends how you define spirituality, because I think if your spirituality is, let's say it's religious, or my spirituality, and this is where Emma kind of why she segued into it. My spirituality, where I find spirituality, is in nature. That when I find those moments of awe at a sunset or a sunrise, or being around trees, when I just suddenly get this sense of the energy and how connected I am to something else that's living and breathing, that but is a tree or whatever it might be. That for me, I'm connected to something that's a whole and that's bigger than myself. That's my spirituality. I think everyone, and today, I guess it depends how you define spirituality. And if you've got some clients who are turned against, like, off just by the word spirituality, I think it's finding another word, because I think everyone has felt those moments of connection in nature, especially, but in other places, with family members sometimes, or in relationship with something. And I think it's that, possibly it's also in relationship with something else, some other bigger than you or whatever.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I agree, and that reflects my own spirituality. And I think with most clients you can get to that. What I was going to say is that with some clients, if I'm comfortable enough, I will share or question, or there is so much fear in the system that is bound up from the minute that you came into the world, that and we'll explore this together. It makes intuitive sense that we need to find something to trust in, because that has been my experience. Of course, I don't share that with every client, but my experience of my own healing is that there was a switch as I did lean into the spiritual piece, and then moved into trust and flow, and and I can feel it now, when I'm leaning into that universal connection, whatever you want to call it. I'm flowing, I'm trusting. That is radically different to the space that I used to occupy, which was restricted and fear-led. And when I go there, everything just shuts down. And I think for those with the trauma history, there is a calling to, and it's so hard. And also, I do not use this word in session because it is wildly inappropriate. But there is a calling to find something to trust. There just is. So of course, our job as a clinician is, what is that? As you say, is that a connection to nature? Ultimately, of course, it's self-trust. It's finding that self-anchor. Absolutely.
That for me is it's be able to be centered to connect to something bigger, whatever that looks like: religion, other people, nature, however that. But if you can come into yourself, then you're kind of in that space to be able to connect. And so, we talk about purpose, because quite often that's about creating meaning from a sense or a feeling. So I'm glad we
I also, talking about that kind of sense of like, I've spoken about this with Emma before, but like, I know when I'm so disconnected from myself, is when I feel most lonely and most like miserable, and whatever mental health issues might be coming up for me is when I'm in around a lot of people, very busy socially, and very much like, if I'm in London and I'm constantly in meetings with people who you'd think as a human I'm constantly in connection with others, so I should feel more connected and less lonely. And what I find is, if I'm out of nature for a prolonged period of time, I am totally and utterly disconnected from myself, and I feel lonely. All I need is to go back to Wales and if I can be in Wales for 5 days consecutively, I could see no one and be around, and the loneliness would disappear. And I know that's because by connecting to nature, I've managed to reconnect with myself. So therefore, that's my connecting to the spirit, what I consider that spiritual whole, then enables me to reconnect and do that connection to that place where, as you just said, I need to be able to trust myself.
Absolutely, because, and I talk about this in the book, that's the top of the mountain. That sense of connection that you get is not a lived experience for people with a trauma history. That's something that comes through healing, through recovery, through a spiritual journey, through, that connection is what it's about. For me, it's my spiritual practices. I meditate, I'm chakra obsessed. So I have my own way of doing that. And there's the nature piece as well, but I totally agree. And helping each client individually find a way to experience that sense of connection, whether it's through awe and wonder, whether it's through some kind of hobby, but it's the feeling, isn't it? It's that feeling of connection.
And that's the thing, and it can come from everyone is different. For me, it might be nature. For you, it might be meditation. For others, it might be singing together in a group, in a choir, whatever. There are so many ways to get that connection, and I think that's what's so great about the potential of healing, that it is. And that's why I love the fact that you brought this to kind of ecotherapy and to say that is accessible healing. And there are more, like, as I said, there are multiple ways of healing people that don't only, I mean, a therapist is a great start if you can, if you've got the resources for it, but there are many other ways, out there that will help individuals, I think.
And people are always surprised, but it's like when you think about the flow state piece of it, how essential. People are always surprised when I'm kind of saying, where's the fun, where's the play, where's the dancing, where's like, yes, we need to resolve, we need to look at the trauma energy, there's processing, release that needs to happen, but we need a groundswell of all the good stuff too. Like, where's the silliness, where's the laughter, where's the dancing, so absolutely. And that's often where the connection is first experienced.
Yeah, totally. 100%.
Right. Sarah, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. Thank you for making time.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's been amazing. I can't wait to see you in Oxford. I cannot wait to see you.
I know, I feel very good about that.
Oxford. Yeah, it's going to be great. It's going to be great.
It's been an absolute pleasure. I feel very
Likewise.
full.